Well, hello, friends, and welcome again to the weekend worship. We have some wonderful lessons today that fill in from last week's story of John the Baptist. In the gospel for today, we have the first interaction that Jesus has with his early apostles when he's calling them to him. He uses words we all know, "Follow me," and each one in the story has a different answer. In each instance, just like we have finished at the baptism of John, in the story when God recognized Jesus as God's Son, the disciples recognize him as the Messiah and as God's Son. Part of the fun of Epiphany is we get to hear these stories again and again. And what's interesting about this is that Jesus sees the disciples for who they are, and the disciples see Jesus for who he is. Last week, I gave a couple of quotes from C.S. Lewis, and I want to remind you about one of them, because I think it's also fitting for this week's sermon. Towards the end of the quote, C.S. Lewis says, "Next to the blessed sacraments themselves, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses." In today's psalm, this is one of my favorite psalms. When I was in a different part of my career, I did a lot of youth ministry, and this was a psalm that was used as a cornerstone of some of the curriculum that we used for confirmation. And we read this psalm on a regular basis and prayed it to help us to understand in a more deep way God's involvement in our life. This particular psalm is beautiful in its imagery and also in the intimate relationship that we have with God. "Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down, my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places, and are acquainted with all my ways." And the psalm goes on, "That you even know and you knit me together in my mother's womb." Think about that for just a minute, about that kind of relationship that you have with God. God is one that knows your inner thoughts, your inner being, your journeys, your resting places, and God knows all your ways. A friend of mine who had a website early on, whenever you would use your cursor across his website, it would say, "Where can I flee from you, O God?" and a text around it. I always kind of loved that. It was an image that stayed with me. And so I want you to just think about that for a minute, about what that means for you in terms of your importance as a child of God, both in what C.S. Lewis says about how the neighbors around us are often the closest and holiest thing we can encounter, and that you too are that blessed child of God. Like last week, our political crescendo of the difficulties, disparities, and divisions within our country is very loud as we've gone through another presidential impeachment and as we prepare for a transfer of power, and as we continue to deal with the attempted insurrection and violence at the nation's capital. And while I think that is very important and critical for all of us to pay attention, I think there's something else that might be even more so on our hearts and on our minds, whether we can name it or not. As we continue, and we're almost to a full year since we've been able to have normal church and normal activities. We're getting closer and closer to the time when we went into the initial shutdowns and shelter-at-home orders, and it's hard to believe it's been almost a year. As we look around us, the case rates continue to rise, and the number of people who have COVID or have had COVID goes up, and the death count is going higher and higher each day to unfathomable numbers in my mind, and I'm sure in your mind as well. We have hope in the vaccine is out But in much the same way, it's raising our anxiety because we don't always know when we're going to get it. They've prioritized who will receive it by thinking of the communities that are in them and the communities that are most vulnerable and also most essential for the functioning of our society. If you're in those groups, it's awesome that you're able to receive the vaccine early, as I know many of our doctors and nurses and medical workers have already received the vaccine, and many in our nursing homes. And I believe today on Friday, as we're preparing this, the county is getting ready to release the signups for those in the next group who are 65 and older and other essential workers. But if you're in the other groups, you're beginning to hear of how people are wanting to cut in line or to find a way to get the vaccine because we all know the risk. While most people who get it tend to get over it fairly quickly, there is a good percentage, something like 20%, that get severe illness, and a percentage of those who end up hospitalized, and of course, a percentage of those who end up in ICU and on ventilation and other emergency measures, and many who have died. It's hard for us not to put that fear, that concern, and also the collective grief that's happening within our society with so many losses. The losses of friends and families, the losses of intimate community that we all yearn for, the losses of jobs and economic security, the losses that are immeasurable for our students and teachers and many others throughout society. I say that because I think it becomes critically important in these times, because times of crisis like this kind of do several things for people. They can sometimes bring out the worst in us, which is probably which I definitely think we saw last week in some of the actions at our nation's capital, or we can even see within our own communities as maybe people aren't willing to be compliant with the rules that health officials have put together, or their frustrations and real anger in the midst of all of that grief, which is a very common response to grief. But in the same way, we're called to another kind of response, which is often to rise to the occasion, which that means to do what we can to reach out to our neighbors and others around us, to be willing to follow the guidelines from the health department and others that give them to us, to do our best to function and to understand that all of us are going through this difficult time together, and all of us are impacted in deep ways. And I suppose there's another one in which we're numb and even sometimes unable to function, or even closed off from contact with others or in other ways. In all these myriad of responses, what happens when we keep what we hear in the scriptures today at the center of who we are and let it guide us in how we feel, but also in how we respond to all that's going on around us? I think when we see our neighbors, as C.S. Lewis calls out to us to see them as the next closest thing that we can get to holiness. And when we pray this psalm and we remember our own place in God's kingdom as one of God's children and as a disciple, that we are valued and loved. I think with those two in combination, we can be the kind of people that rise to the occasion and reach out to others in love. I think that's what Jesus saw in the disciples in his calling to them, for them to follow him. He was calling them into a life of service and into a life of caring for the world around us and into a life of bringing others into God's kingdom. At the end of the sermon, we're going to hear a beautiful offering of music by Isaac Cates. Some of you might recognize Isaac. He has been to St. Thomas in the past and offered music to us. He's a former student of Dr. Beth Elswick's and Jim Elswick's. And he writes incredible music that is in the vein of gospel, but is also very powerful. And in this particular song, I want you to listen closely to the words and lyrics that Isaac has written in a prayerful way about these very concepts, about how we are beloved by God deeply, and that God is always with us in our suffering and in our challenges that we have in our life, even when we don't feel it. Isaac writes this as a song in response to community grief of the loss of loved ones. And you'll see many people, some famous people that you know in the images, some who died tragically, some who died in the tragedy of suicide, and others who died in the normal rhythms of life. But that sense of hope that we can find in our grief as we walk through these times. You'll hear another piece of music towards the end of the service called Hold On, and a spiritual that's powerfully written by Isaac as well. That's also a call to prayer. And that music, Hold On, comes from the great spirituals written in the African American community during the time of slaves and after that, when they were calling out prayer from those very fields. I hope these two pieces of music can draw you closer to God in this time and closer to that very notion of hope that we all yearn for. So, the challenge is to find ways to rise up to the occasion as a beloved child of God and as one that God knows in the knitting of our mother's womb, to our innermost thoughts, to our waking and our sleeping, and who knows all our ways. To see ourselves as one beloved, but also empowered to ministry around us. So I hope you join me in rising up to the moment. Amen.
Restores my soul when my life has lost control. Never leave when all else bends me. Walks away when all else abandons me, and who restores my soul when my life has lost control. So God, I place trust in you. So I place my faith in you. I know that you love me. In your presence I find all I need. My Lord, you are with me always to the end of though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will. My God, oh, you have all I need. You are my God, yeah. dwell in your house in the time of trouble. You hide me. You have all I need. You have me. You have me. Oh, you have my heart completely.
No matter what comes my way, I've made up in my mind to trust you. My storage is empty.
Oh, you have me all. My storage is empty and I am available to you. Oh, my life is not my own. To you I belong. I give myself wholly. I give myself to you. Oh, you have me, Jesus.